August 9th, 48 BC, the plains of Pharsalus, central Greece. The air is thick with dust and the smell of iron. Two Roman armies, the largest the world has ever seen, face each other across a flat, sun-baked field in Thessaly. On one side stands Julius Caesar, the man who conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and terrified the entire Roman Senate into fleeing the city. On the other side stands Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, the man who had once been Caesar's ally, his friend, his family, now his enemy. The numbers are staggering. Pompey commands roughly 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar has 22,000 infantry and barely 1,000 horsemen. By every rational calculation, this battle should not even be close. Pompey should crush Caesar before noon, ride back to Rome in triumph, and write the ending to this civil war himself. But buried somewhere inside Pompey's battle line, hidden among the standard legionaries, carrying no special banner, wearing no distinguishing uniform, are 2,000 men who have absolutely no business being on this battlefield. These men have already finished their service. They took their discharge papers. They accepted their land grants. They went home. Some of them probably had wives, farms, and grandchildren waiting for them. By every legal and social definition Rome possessed, their war was over. And yet here they are, standing in formation, gripping their weapons, ready to kill again. Who were these men? They weren't the Praetorian Guard. They weren't some exotic foreign mercenary unit. They were something older, stranger, and in many ways far more terrifying than either. But they were the Evocati, Rome's recalled veterans, the soldiers who came back from retirement to fight one more war. And in a moment, I'm going to show you exactly why every great Roman commander from Julius Caesar to Augustus Caesar treated these men like the most valuable weapon in the entire imperial arsenal. But to understand why 2,000 retired soldiers ended up standing on the most consequential battlefield of the ancient world, we need to go back, way back, to the moment Rome accidentally created the most dangerous kind of soldier imaginable. The Evocati didn't appear from nowhere. Their story starts with the collapse of one version of Rome and the painful, violent birth of another. It starts with a general who broke every rule about who could pick up a sword and accidentally created a class of professional warriors whose entire identity was built around war. It starts with the Marian Revolution, and it ends, much later, in the private bedchamber of an emperor. Let's begin. Picture Rome in 107 BC. Not the gleaming marble city of the movies, the real Rome. A city under immense pressure from every direction, managing an empire that has grown faster than anyone planned for, fighting wars in North Africa, managing restless provinces in Spain, watching with genuine dread as Germanic tribes mass along the northern frontier. The old system for raising an army, essentially drafting property-owning farmers for a campaign season and then sending them home when the weather turned, is visibly, catastrophically breaking down. But the problem was structural, and it had been building for generations. Roman law required soldiers to own a minimum amount of property before they could serve. The logic made intuitive sense once upon a time. A man with land had something concrete to fight for, and he could afford to purchase his own weapons and armor without the state having to supply them. But as Rome's wars grew longer and geographically more distant, those same farmers were being pulled away from their fields for years at a stretch. When they came back, if they came back, their farms had collapsed. Creditors had moved in. Wealthy senators and their networks had bought up the land at ruinous prices and turned it into vast slave-worked agricultural estates called latifundia, where the pool of property-owning men eligible for military service was contracting with every generation, precisely at the moment Rome's military ambitions were expanding to fill the known world. Enter Gaius Marius, 7-time consul. one of the most consequential military reformers in all of ancient history. A man from a family of equestrian rank outside the traditional senatorial aristocracy, which meant he had built his career entirely on merit, not on birth, and had absolutely zero patience for traditions that weren't working. Marius threw out the property requirement entirely. He opened the legions to the capit censi, literally those counted by the head, because they owned nothing worth formally assessing in the census. He standardized equipment so the state provided what individual soldiers couldn't afford to purchase themselves. But he organized the legion into cohorts rather than the old maniple system, creating a more flexible and tactically responsive fighting unit. He made the eagle, the aquila, the universal standard of the Roman legion, replacing the diverse menagerie of animal symbols that different units had carried before. On paper, this was a pragmatic and brilliant solution to a genuine manpower crisis. In practice, though nobody fully appreciated it at the time, Marius had just detonated a slow-burning charge beneath the Roman Republic. The timer was already running. Here is why. When you take a man with nothing, no land, no property, no social standing, no particular prospects in the civilian world, give him a weapon and armor paid for by the state, march him across the known world for 15 to 25 years, but train him in organized violence until it is the only trade he genuinely understands, and then discharge him at the end of his service term. What do you have? You have a man whose entire identity, his closest friendships, his sense of daily purpose, his knowledge of how the world works, all of it is wrapped up in military life. The army wasn't something he did to earn money between other activities. The army was who he was. And when that life ended, the silence of civilian retirement could be genuinely unbearable. Marius's soldiers also felt something that the old citizen militia had not felt so acutely: personal loyalty to their general. Because the state had stopped being the entity that fed, equipped, and promised to reward them. Their general did that. He was the one who would secure the land grants. For he was the one who extended their contracts when campaigns ran long. He was the one who stood between them and poverty when their service ended. Their loyalty, rational and emotional both, flowed upward not to the abstract Roman state or the distant Senate, but to the specific man who commanded them. This is the world that created the Evocati. Not through deliberate design, nobody sat in a room and said, "Let's create a class of recalled veterans who will be worth double their weight in regular troops." It happened through the inevitable logic of what military professionalization actually does to human beings. When you build an army of men whose entire identity is structured around warfare, you eventually discover that some of them cannot stay away. When a great commander, a Caesar, a Pompey, an Octavian, sent personal word that he needed them again, some men put down their farming tools, strapped on armor they had kept polished out of habit, and walked back toward the sound of the trumpets. Those men were the Evocati, and Rome, at first, had no idea what it had created. Before we go deeper into exactly who the Evocati were and what distinguished them so dramatically from ordinary soldiers, I want to take you back to that field in Thessaly. Because the Battle of Pharsalus isn't just a backdrop for this story, it is the story. It is the moment where everything we are discussing becomes concrete, visceral, and historically consequential in ways that still echo today. To appreciate what happened at Pharsalus, you need to understand the weeks that led up to it, and specifically the uncomfortable position Pompey found himself in. By the summer of 48 BC, Pompey was, objectively speaking, winning the war. His supply lines were intact. Caesar's army was tired, undersupplied, operating far from home territory, and had recently suffered a genuine tactical reverse at Dyrrhachium, where Pompey's larger force had actually pushed Caesar back and inflicted real damage. Caesar himself, by his own account, acknowledged that if Pompey had pressed the advantage at Dyrrhachium with more aggression, The war might have ended there. But Pompey didn't press the advantage. He was playing a longer game. Keep Caesar moving, stretch his supply lines, let logistics do the killing. The problem was that Pompey's army wasn't just soldiers. It was the Roman Senate in exile. Senators and nobles who had fled Rome rather than submit to Caesar, growing increasingly impatient. They called Pompey Agamemnon behind his back, a reference to the Greek king who prolonged the Trojan War to extend his own command. The pressure was relentless. Pompey, a better general than history sometimes gives him credit for, but also a politician who needed his allies, made the decision that would end his life. He came down off his hill and deployed onto the plain. Caesar, watching from across the field, understood immediately what he was seeing. His veterans had been waiting for exactly this moment. Now let's talk about the battlefield geometry, because it matters enormously for understanding what the Evocati actually did and why. Pompey's great advantage was cavalry, 7,000 horsemen against Caesar's mere 1,000. His plan was tactically sound on its own terms. Hold the infantry lines in place, to absorb Caesar's frontal assault while keeping his own infantry stationary to preserve their energy and psychological steadiness, and then unleash the cavalry on Caesar's exposed right flank. The horsemen would sweep around behind Caesar's infantry line, hit them from the rear, and collapse the entire Caesarian formation in a pincer. It had worked for commanders before. Against a less experienced opponent, it would have worked here too. But Caesar had been thinking carefully about cavalry tactics for months. He had watched Pompey's horsemen. He knew their quality and their confidence, and he understood something that Pompey perhaps had not fully considered. A cavalry charge against an infantry force that is prepared for it is a completely different tactical problem than a charge against infantry that doesn't see it coming. The Caesar quietly pulled 6 cohorts, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men, out of his 3rd infantry line and repositioned them at an oblique angle behind his right flank. Hidden from direct observation by the positioning of the other units, held back from the initial engagement, waiting with the patience that only truly experienced soldiers can maintain in the chaos of a building battle. These were not random men. These were veterans. Men who had the psychological steadiness to hold their position while the battle erupted around them, to watch the cavalry bearing down, to wait for Caesar's signal, and to move at exactly the right moment rather than a moment too soon from fear or a moment too late from hesitation. The Evocati embedded in Pompey's line were doing what they were trained to do, holding steady in the center, to providing the psychological anchor that kept inexperienced troops from breaking under the pressure of Caesar's assault. On paper, the battle was following Pompey's script. When Pompey's 7,000 cavalry charged, it was genuinely terrifying. Caesar's horsemen were pushed back through sheer weight of numbers, exactly as planned. The Pompeian riders began wheeling into deployment position to sweep around Caesar's exposed right flank. Pompey's officers on that wing were probably already composing their victory speeches. And then Caesar released his hidden cohorts. What happened next is one of the most tactically precise moments in the history of ancient warfare. These soldiers, according to Caesar's own account in the Bellum Civile, were specifically instructed not to throw their pila in the standard fashion. Instead, they were told to aim upward, to thrust their javelins at the faces of the cavalrymen. The eyes, the unprotected mouths and cheekbones above the standard cavalry armor. Pompey's horsemen were equipped and trained for fighting other cavalry, for pursuing routing infantry. They were not prepared for a wall of infantry suddenly appearing from behind their own lines, driving weapons up toward their faces at close range. The psychological effect was catastrophic and instantaneous. These weren't hardened infantry veterans absorbing cavalry impact through sheer discipline. These were horse archers, foreign auxiliaries, conscripted Eastern levies, diverse troops who had never trained for this specific scenario. When horses panic under heavy fire, and when riders are suddenly fighting for their lives instead of executing a sweeping flank maneuver, unit cohesion shatters almost instantly. The entire Pompeian cavalry wing, 7,000 horsemen, collapsed and fled the field. Caesar's hidden cohorts then turned inward. They drove into Pompey's infantry line from the flank that the cavalry had just abandoned. Simultaneously, Caesar ordered his third line, which he had held back in reserve throughout the entire engagement, to advance. Pompey's infantry, caught between a frontal assault and a flanking attack, many of them inexperienced Eastern troops who had been told to stand still and absorb punishment rather than charge, simply broke. Pompey himself, watching from a position of command as his entire plan disintegrated in real time, he reportedly sat in stunned, motionless silence, then rode back to his camp, then changed out of his military cloak, mounted a horse, and fled. The man who had been the most powerful general in the Roman world for 30 years couldn't process what he was watching. The numbers had been on his side. He had more men, more cavalry, better supply lines, and the political support of the Senate. It should not have ended this way. But here is what I want you to hold in your mind as we continue through this story. Hidden in Pompey's line, part of his most trusted, most reliable corps, were those 2,000 Evocati, men who had fought campaigns across the Mediterranean, those who understood Caesar's tactical habits at a cellular level because they had spent years in legions that faced the same challenges Caesar had faced, who were, and by every objective assessment, the most experienced soldiers on that entire field. And even they could not save Pompey from a mistake made before the first sword was drawn. The decision to engage, the capitulation to political pressure, the abandonment of patient strategic advantage, that was made in the council tent, not on the battlefield. The Evocati could anchor a line. They could hold against Caesar's veterans hour for hour. They could not undo a strategic error made days before the battle began. That is the most important lesson of Pharsalus. Experience can compensate for a lot of disadvantages. It cannot compensate for a general who has stopped trusting his own judgment. Before we keep going, I want to pause here because what we've just walked through is genuinely one of the most fascinating tactical engagements in all of ancient history. And I know some of you are watching this on your lunch break, or late at night, or stuck in traffic. Wherever you are, if this is landing for you the way it's landing for me as I put it together, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. Seriously, I read every single one of those. It's one of my favorite things about making this kind of content. So let's talk about what an evocatus actually was, formally, legally, institutionally, because the historical record is murkier than you might expect, and the murkiness itself is revealing. The formal definition is clean enough on its surface. An evocatus, plural evocati, was a Roman soldier who had completed his full standard term of military service, received his honesta missio, his honorable discharge, and then voluntarily re-enlisted at the personal invitation of a consul, commanding general, or emperor. The word itself comes from the Latin evocare, to call forth, to summon. These were the summoned ones, not volunteers who walked in off the street, not conscripts dragged back into service, men who were specifically called by name, or at least by reputation, and who chose to answer. For a legionary under the Augustan military system, which formalized and extended what had been evolving through the late Republic, the standard term was 20 years of full active service, with an optional additional 5 years in a lighter reserve capacity. Auxiliary soldiers, as the non-citizen troops who served in specialized support units, served 25 years, after which they received not just discharge, but full Roman citizenship, one of the most meaningful social rewards the empire could offer. These weren't short tours. A man who enlisted at 18 and served the full 20-year term was nearly 40 when he received his honesta missio. A 25-year auxiliary veteran was pushing his mid-40s. These men had spent more of their adult lives in military service than out of it. During those decades, a legionary had probably campaigned in multiple provinces. He had survived siege warfare, open field battles, ambushes in mountain passes, river crossings under fire, disease outbreaks in summer camps, and the grinding institutional violence of Roman military discipline, which, it should be noted, it was applied not just to enemies, but to Roman soldiers themselves, with beatings and executions for cowardice, desertion, and failures of duty. He had watched men he considered brothers die in ways that would require years of trauma processing by modern clinical standards. He had learned, through brutal practical experience, exactly how human beings respond under extreme physical and psychological pressure. And then the invitation arrived. Or word spread through the network of veteran settlements, the military colonies that Augustus would eventually plant across the empire like seeds of Romanization, that a commander was assembling his old soldiers. The question that has always fascinated me about the Evocati is the simplest one. Why did they say yes? With what possible combination of incentives and psychology led a man who had already survived 20 years of Roman military service to voluntarily go back? The practical incentives were real and substantial. Evocati were paid significantly more than standard legionaries. Sources suggest double pay was not uncommon, which in the Roman military context was an enormous differential. They were officially exempt from the most physically degrading and soul-crushing of the standard military duties. No digging camp fortifications, no road building, no the endless manual labor that occupied most of a legionary's non-combat time. They rode horses, traveling with the mounted officer class, rather than marching on foot with the infantry. And they carried the vine staff, the vitis, the traditional symbol of centurion authority, which gave them the formal right to physically discipline soldiers below them in rank. In a culture that ran on visible, tangible markers of social status, that vine staff was not a trivial symbol. It was a declaration, visible to every soldier who saw it, that this man had earned the right to enforce discipline, that his authority came not from appointment, but from experience. Tax exemptions are extended beyond their service. Their families were shielded from inheritance taxes, manumission taxes, the taxes on freeing slaves, and certain indirect duties. Legal immunities protected them for life from non-patrimonial public obligations, mandatory municipal offices, billeting requirements, and the various civic burdens that Roman law imposed on property-owning residents. After discharge, an evocatus and his family occupied a privileged legal position in whatever community they settled in. But money and exemptions don't fully explain it. Veterans in every era have struggled with the transition to civilian life in ways that don't always respond to economic solutions. The structure that military service provides, the hierarchy, the clarity of purpose, the community of people who understand your experience because they lived it alongside you, none of it has a civilian equivalent. A farmer who served with you for 20 years is not going to look at you the way the man next to you in a shield wall did. The bonds forged under sustained, life-threatening pressure are categorically different from peacetime friendships. The civilian world can feel genuinely less real. And then there's the identity question, which I think is the deepest layer. If you spent your formative adult decades as a soldier of Rome, if your entire framework for understanding yourself, your competence, your courage, your place in the world, was forged in the legions, then who are you when you're not a soldier? What do you call yourself when the title that meant the most is gone? For some men, going back was not about money or status or adventure. It was about being, again, the person they understood themselves to be. The re-enlistment ceremony for an evocatus acknowledged all of this with a seriousness that I find genuinely moving. It wasn't a bureaucratic process. It involved the formal renewal of the sacramentum, the military oath, a binding, sacred vow of allegiance that invoked the gods as witnesses and promised divine penalties for betrayal. And this was not a formality. In Roman religious and legal culture, an oath sworn to the gods was the most serious commitment a person could make. Renewing it was an act of profound self-recommitment, and associated with that renewal was the rite connected to the name that some Evocati carried, Filii Martis, sons of Mars, the god of war's own children, voluntarily returning to his service. The sources are frustratingly vague about the specific nature of this rite. It is described only as rather bloody, which in the context of Roman religious practice could mean almost anything. But the name itself tells us everything important. These men weren't re-enlisting as soldiers who happened to have experience. They were, through the ceremony, reconstituting themselves as something more than soldiers. That they were consecrating their return to war as an act of devotion. Think about what it means for an institution to construct a ritual around the act of choosing to go back into combat. It acknowledges, implicitly, that this choice is not normal human behavior. It requires more than rational calculation to explain, that it needs sanctification. Rome's way of honoring the Evocati wasn't just financial, it was metaphysical. The doubled pay said, "Your skills are worth more." The vine staff said, "Your authority is real." The Sons of Mars' rite said, "What you are doing is sacred." In terms of formal military hierarchy, the Evocati occupied a genuinely unusual space. They ranked above ordinary legionaries, miles gregari, but generally below full centurions, unless they were promoted into the centurionate as part of their re-enlistment package, which happened frequently. They could command centuries in specific tactical contexts. Caesar's Bellum Civile describes Evocati being deployed to lead detachments, small units operating semi-independently, the kind of task that required experienced judgment rather than just obedience. Cicero, in his correspondence, specifically the letters known as Ad Familiares, mentions a Praefectus Evocatorum, a commanding officer specifically designated to lead a formation of Evocati. That detail is enormously significant. It means that at least in some armies during the late Republican period, the Evocati were sufficiently numerous and sufficiently distinct as a group that they warranted their own dedicated command structure. They weren't just scattered as individual leavening through the regular units, or they could be organized and deployed as a coherent sub-formation with their own officer. The physical evidence is rare, but irreplaceable. We have a stone altar, still surviving, dedicated to Jupiter by a man who identifies himself as Attilius Primus, Evocatus of Legio 14 Gemina. That inscription is one of the few moments where an individual Evocatus steps out of the collective shadows of historical record and becomes a specific, named human being. A man with a dedication, a unit, a god he prayed to, and a status he was proud enough of to carve into permanent stone. That altar tells me everything I need to know about how these men thought of themselves, not as men who couldn't make civilian life work, not as mercenaries chasing additional income. As Evocati, as men who had been called, who had answered, and who wore that answer as the defining honor of their lives. No commander in Roman history understood the Evocati better than Julius Caesar, and I want to be direct about this because I think it gets lost in the larger narrative of Caesar as military genius and political revolutionary. Caesar didn't just use the Evocati as a tactical tool. He cultivated, deliberately and with extraordinary psychological intelligence, the conditions that made men want to be recalled by him specifically. The relationship between Caesar and his veterans is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated dynamics in all of ancient history, and it shaped the fate of the Roman world. Caesar treated his soldiers differently from most Roman commanders of his era, and the difference was not superficial. And he knew their names, not the centurions and tribunes and senior officers whose names a general was expected to know, but the ordinary legionaries, the men in the ranks. He addressed them publicly and personally, not as an undifferentiated mass of troops, but as individuals with specific histories, specific acts of valor, specific grievances that deserved to be heard. He shared their hardships in ways that went beyond what political calculation would have demanded. He ate what they ate, marched when they marched, appeared at the most difficult points of construction work and siege operations and river crossings, present and visible and seemingly indifferent to his own comfort. His men didn't just respect him the way soldiers are trained to respect authority. They loved him. And that distinction matters enormously in the context of the Evocati, because the entire system rested on a specific kind of emotional bond, the bond between a soldier and a commander who made him feel that his sacrifice was seen, valued, and remembered. When Caesar loved you back, when he called on you specifically, when his invitation arrived and it carried the weight of genuine personal recognition, you came. Refusing was not just declining a re-enlistment contract. It was failing a person who had never failed you. The evidence for Caesar's operational use of Evocati is woven through his own writings, which creates a fascinating interpretive challenge. Caesar wasn't writing objective military history, but he was composing political propaganda wearing the disguise of a military memoir, carefully constructed narratives designed to justify his actions, burnish his reputation, and shape the historical record in his favor. When the Evocati appear in the Commentarii, they appear organically, embedded in tactical description, because their presence was real enough and important enough that even a propagandist of Caesar's sophistication couldn't or didn't bother to sanitize them out. In Bellum Gallicum Book 7, Chapter 65, during the desperate and genuinely perilous final phase of the Gallic campaign, the war against Vercingetorix that nearly broke Caesar's entire Gallic project, Caesar mentions taking horses from his tribunes, knights, and re-enlisted veterans to reinforce his cavalry when his allied Gallic and Germanic horsemen needed support. That small passing detail is actually quite revealing. Re-enlisted veterans, Evocati, were present in Caesar's Gallic campaigns, operating at a high enough organizational level that they had horses to be requisitioned. They weren't digging latrines. They weren't in the 7th row of the 3rd cohort. They were among the mounted officer class, functioning at the upper operational tier of the army. By the time of the Civil War itself, the Evocati's role becomes even more explicitly visible in the sources. In Bellum Civile Book 1, Caesar describes in careful detail Pompey's recruitment effort at the outbreak of hostilities, how Pompey traveled through the veteran colonies of Italy, and calling on men who had served under him in previous campaigns, promising them the command of centuries and the rewards of eventual victory. This is the Evocati recruitment process described in real time, by an observer watching it happen to his rival and simultaneously preparing to execute the same playbook himself. The numbers Caesar preserves from Pharsalus, 2,000 Evocati in Pompey's force, referenced in Bellum Civile Book 3, deserve careful attention. 2,000 men are not a handful of veterans scattered through the ranks for symbolic morale effect. That is a full-strength double cohort of organized, experienced fighters, a unit large enough to be counted separately in the operational assessment, deployed deliberately in the battle line, more functioning as a coherent tactical element rather than as individual supplementary soldiers. At Pharsalus, the Evocati weren't a sentiment, they were a weapon. And then Caesar is dead. March 15th, 44 BC, stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Theater of Pompey, a building named for the man he had defeated 6 years earlier in a chamber of the Senate that met there when the regular Senate House was under repair, by men he had personally pardoned after that victory, and subsequently elevated to positions of power and trust. The most powerful individual in the Roman world is suddenly, violently gone, and the question of who fills that vacuum is going to be answered through blood. Enter Octavian. Gaius Octavius Thurinus, 18 years old. Sickly, genuinely, chronically unwell in ways that would have ended most military careers before they began. Politically inexperienced, having accomplished nothing of public note beyond being Julius Caesar's great-nephew, essentially, and, as it turned out, his primary heir by secret testamentary adoption. By every conventional measurement of Roman political power, this young man should have been swept off the board within months by Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had Caesar's veteran legions under his command, Caesar's political network, Caesar's military reputation absorbed through years of proximity. Antony looked at Octavian and saw what everyone saw: a boy. A convenient name attached to a convenient legal claim, easily managed and eventually discarded. Octavian went to Campania. Specifically, but he traveled to the network of veteran colonies that Caesar had established across southern Italy, the towns and settlements where Caesar's discharged soldiers had been given land grants and told to build lives outside the military. And Octavian, 18 years old, no military record, no victories, no reputation of his own, called on those veterans. Personally, he distributed money from Caesar's estate. He made promises about their futures, and he invoked, repeatedly and unambiguously, the memory and the name of the man they had followed for 20 years. Cassius Dio's account of this moment is remarkable. Men who had served Julius Caesar, men who had no rational basis for trusting this teenager with nothing to recommend him except the right surname, picked up weapons they had put away and followed Octavian's standard. Not because Octavian was impressive, because Caesar had been, and the sacramentum, even an informal version of it, even an emotional rather than legal one, that bound them to Caesar's memory was still active. The name was the inheritance. And Octavian had it. This is the moment in all of Roman history that I find most extraordinary, most instructive, most underappreciated in mainstream discussions of how Rome became Rome. The entire subsequent trajectory of the Roman Empire, everything that came after it, Augustus's 40-year reign, the Pax Romana, the legal and cultural framework that shaped Western civilization for 2,000 years and is still shaping it now, pivots on a teenager walking into a veteran's settlement and saying the right name. And the veterans answered. That is what the Evocati system meant, at its deepest level. Not just the tactical value of experienced soldiers on a battlefield, the transmission of political legitimacy through the bond between a great commander and the men who served him. The loyalty didn't die with Caesar. It was transferable. And Octavian was smart enough, cold enough, and perhaps desperate enough to understand that and use it. I want to be honest about Octavian here. There's something genuinely chilling about an 18-year-old who understands, with that level of clarity, how to weaponize other people's grief and loyalty. The veterans who followed Octavian in 44 BC were not following a man who had earned their respect through shared hardship. They were following a name, a claim, a piece of legal paperwork. Octavian was smart enough to give them something to attach their loyalty to, and ruthless enough to use it without sentimentality. That combination, cold calculation wearing the mask of filial devotion, is, I would argue, the defining characteristic of the man who would become Augustus. Augustus won. That fact is so settled in history that it's easy to lose the contingency of it, the sheer number of moments between 44 BC and 31 BC, where the whole project could have collapsed. Antony was more experienced, more personally impressive, more politically connected. Lepidus had legions, Brutus and Cassius had the moral authority of the Republican cause. Sextus Pompey had a navy that nearly strangled Italy. But Augustus, still thinking of him as Octavian through most of this period, though he would acquire the honorific name in 27 BC, outmaneuvered them all. And when the last of them, Antony and Cleopatra, died in Alexandria in 30 BC, Octavian was the last man standing. And one of his first priorities, with the methodical patience that defined his entire approach to governance, was making sure that nothing like the last century of Roman history ever happened again. A century of civil wars, of armies loyal to individual generals rather than to the state, of the Marian reform's darkest consequences playing out in generation after generation of political violence. Augustus wanted stability. He wanted permanence. He wanted to build something that would outlast him. Part of that project required taking institutions that had operated on the basis of personal loyalty that was inherently unstable because it died with the person, and transforming them into institutions built on systemic loyalty to the office and to the position, to the emperor as an institution rather than to any specific individual filling the role. The Evocati were exactly this kind of resource, powerful, useful, potentially destabilizing if allowed to remain purely ad hoc, and personally attached to specific commanders, but invaluable if properly formalized and brought under direct imperial control. The vehicle for this transformation was the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard, as Augustus organized and institutionalized it, was Rome's first permanent military force stationed in Italy itself. 9 cohorts, eventually increased to 12 under later emperors, of elite soldiers who were better paid than any other troops in the empire, receiving pay-and-a-half sesquiplex stipendium compared to standard legionary rates. Service in the Guard lasted 16 years, was shorter than the standard legionary term, far more prestigious, and significantly more lucrative at every stage. A Praetorian soldier's entire career trajectory was qualitatively different from a provincial legionary's, closer to the seat of power, more directly connected to the emperor's person, carrying a different weight and visibility in the military hierarchy. When a Praetorian soldier completed his 16 years and received his honorable discharge, he was a man of considerable resources and considerable reputation. He had served at the center of the empire. He had been in proximity to imperial decision-making at the highest level. He possessed skills and judgment that no amount of provincial campaign experience could quite replicate. And then, for the very best of them, not all, but the ones the emperor's eye had rested on and found worth keeping, came the invitation. The Evocati Augusti, the imperial recalled. Praetorian veterans who had completed their service and were hand-selected personally by the emperor himself to re-enlist. The crucial distinction from ordinary Evocati is right there in the name. Augusti, imperial. These men didn't re-enlist because a general put out a general call for experienced veterans. The emperor looked at them specifically, by name, and decided they were worth keeping in service. That distinction carried enormous status weight in a culture where proximity to imperial favor was the most meaningful social currency available. They were the only Evocati in the entire Roman military system permitted to attach the adjective Augusti to their designation. Not merely veterans recalled to service, but veterans recalled to imperial service, marked as the emperor's own men with a formal honorific that announced their status to anyone in the military who encountered them. Their functions were multiple and overlapping, and understanding the range of what they did gives you a sense of how the imperial system actually operated at the human level, as opposed to the formal constitutional level that the textbooks describe. Emperor Galba, according to Suetonius, used Evocati Augusti to guard his personal bedchamber. I keep coming back to this detail because it is so specifically revealing. not the throne room, not the audience hall where he received senators and foreign ambassadors. The bedchamber. The room where Galba was most human, most undefended, the most vulnerable to the knives that would eventually end his reign in the chaos of 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors. The men he trusted to stand outside that door were not the regular Praetorians, whose institutional loyalty he had reason to question. They were the Evocati Augusti, hand-picked, twice proven, personally invested in his survival in ways that went beyond formal duty. This practice, Suetonius tells us, was continued under subsequent emperors, which means that across the early imperial period, the men standing guard over the emperor's most private space, the men whose presence or absence at the crucial moment could determine whether an emperor lived or died, were drawn from the Evocati Augusti. That is not a minor detail. That is an emperor's ultimate statement about where his trust resided. On the career and institutional side, the Evocati Augusti served as a mechanism for extending high-quality military service and injecting veteran experience into parts of the system that needed it. They could be promoted to technical administrative posts in Rome, the complex logistical and bureaucratic machinery that kept the capital functioning. They were deployed as instructors, particularly for the specialized skills of standard-bearing and ceremonial military function that carried enormous symbolic importance in imperial culture. Or they could be given command of a century in a regular provincial legion, taking their Praetorian experience, their close-up knowledge of how the imperial system worked and what the emperor expected, and transplanting it into the provincial military culture. The pipeline worked something like this, and understanding it helps clarify how the Roman military elite reproduced itself generation after generation. A talented soldier entered the Praetorian Guard, serving 16 years at the highest operational level of the imperial military. If he distinguished himself sufficiently, if the emperor's attention found him, he received the designation Evocati Augusti upon his honorable discharge and was invited to continue in expanded roles. In exceptional cases, this path could lead to centurion rank within the guard itself, which was the absolute peak of what an enlisted man could achieve without transferring out of the Praetorian structure entirely. For those whose ambitions extended further, the route ran through legionary command, through the provincial military hierarchy, or upward through the equestrian career ladder that ran parallel to the senatorial one. What Augustus had built with the Evocati Augusti was, in modern terms, something between a special forces reserve and a personal intelligence asset. The most experienced, most thoroughly vetted, most personally trusted men in the entire military apparatus, kept literally close, sleeping outside his private quarters. Augustus understood something every successful long-term leader has understood. Institutions are run by the people at their center, not by the formal structures that surround them. In a system where the biggest threat to an emperor's life consistently came from within his own military household, as the next century and a half would demonstrate repeatedly and bloodily, that kind of human architecture was worth more than any constitutional safeguard. We've talked about the Evocati as a status group, as a political instrument, as a tool of imperial loyalty management. Now I want to get specific and concrete about what these men actually did when the fighting started, because the tactical reality of their deployment is as interesting and as instructive as everything else about them. The first and most critical battlefield function was as shock troops at crisis points. Every battle, every serious engagement between organized forces throughout all of military history has moments where the line wavers, where a flank comes under unexpected pressure, where a unit starts to break, and the question of whether that break becomes a rout or a controlled tactical adjustment depends entirely on whether there is someone with enough authority and enough personal steadiness to hold the soldiers around him in place. This is precisely where Evocati were deployed. Not in the opening assault, not as expendable cannon fodder in the first wave, but at the hinge points. The moments where the quality of the soldiers, not their numbers, not their equipment, but their capacity to maintain rational behavior under conditions of extreme fear and physical danger, was the deciding variable. Think about what that means in practice for the soldiers fighting alongside them. A 20-year-old legionary in his first serious engagement is operating on training. There's adrenaline and the desperate social pressure of not wanting to be seen breaking in front of the men to his left and right. His training has prepared him for the mechanics of combat. It has not fully prepared him for the reality of it. The noise, the smell, the extraordinary physical intimacy of close-quarters Roman combat with its short swords and interlocked shields. The psychological horror of watching men who were alive and moving become suddenly, irreversibly, not. He has no frame of reference for how long it has been going on or how long it will continue. He cannot assess whether what he is experiencing is normal battle chaos or imminent catastrophic collapse. Now, put an Evocatus 3 positions down the line from him. A man who has been in this exact situation before, not once, but dozens of times across 20 years of active service, who isn't panicking because panic, for him, has been burned off by repeated exposure. Who knows, from the deep cellular memory of hard experience, exactly when to push and when to hold and when to fall back without routing. Who has seen what a rout looks like and knows with complete confidence that this is not it yet. Who carries in his body and his bearing a quality that communicates itself without words to every soldier within 20 feet of him. This is survivable. I have survived this before. Stay with me. That presence is worth 10 times its numerical value on a battlefield. Modern military psychology has extensive research on how unit cohesion works and why the presence of experienced soldiers prevents panic contagion in larger units. The Romans didn't have the research, but they understood the phenomenon perfectly. The Evocati weren't just fighting. They were constituting, through their presence and their visible confidence, the psychological reality of the battle for everyone around them. The second major function was as tactical advisors operating in real time, close to the command element. Caesar's reference in Bellum Gallicum to Evocati operating among the mounted officer class reveals that these men weren't buried invisibly in the middle of the infantry formation. They were accessible to command. In the fluid, but fast-moving tactical environment of a Roman battle, where information traveled at the speed of a horse or a running soldier, and commanders had to make decisions based on incomplete and rapidly changing situational awareness, having experienced veterans who could offer real-time assessment of what was happening and why was operationally invaluable. A modern equivalent might be the senior non-commissioned officers who, in any well-functioning military, often provide the actual tactical judgment that translates strategic intent into ground-level action. The commissioned officers set direction. The senior NCOs make it happen and tell the commissioned officers when what they're asking for isn't going to work the way they imagine. Or the Evocati filled something like that role, experienced enough to understand what a commander needed to achieve, trusted enough to be given latitude in how they achieved it, and senior enough in the informal hierarchy of battlefield respect that their judgment carried weight with the troops around them. The third major function, which operated primarily away from active battlefields, was training and the transmission of institutional knowledge. This is, in some ways, the most important function of all, even though it's the least dramatic. The Evocati served as instructors for the Aquilifer. The eagle-bearer, or the soldier who carried the most sacred standard of the legion and whose survival in battle was a matter of both tactical and religious importance, and for other standard-bearers who held positions of enormous symbolic and practical weight, in the legion's organizational structure. They served as physical trainers for regular soldiers. They carried, in their memories and their bodies, the accumulated tactical knowledge of decades of Roman campaigning. And I want to be specific about what that means, because the phrase tactical knowledge can sound abstract. This is knowledge about how a particular stretch of terrain affects cavalry effectiveness, about how the psychology of a besieged garrison changes in week 3 versus week 7, about how soldiers fight differently at dawn than at dusk. None of this knowledge is in a manual, for it lives in the men who have experienced it and survived long enough to understand what it means. In a world without databases or institutional repositories, human memory was the only archive available. Evocati were living institutional memory, deployed wherever that memory was most needed. And off the battlefield entirely, Evocati moved into the civilian structures of the Roman state in ways that extended their influence beyond the purely military. Some became army surveyors and architects, applying their knowledge of military construction and logistics to civil engineering. Some became quartermasters, managing the complex supply systems that kept Roman military operations functional. Some joined the Vigils, Rome's combined police and firefighting force, bringing military discipline and organizational habits into urban security structures. The Evocati weren't contained by the military. They were a source of trained, experienced, disciplined human capital that flowed outward from the legions into every institution Rome possessed. Here is the question that I think is the most interesting and the most revealing about the Evocati, and the one that historians, ancient and modern both, have struggled with most. Why don't we know more about them? Why does an institution this important, this central to how Rome's greatest commanders built and maintained military power, leave such a thin and fragmentary trace in the historical record? The answer is structural, and it tells us something important about how military institutions actually work versus how they appear in historical sources. Or the Evocati were not a unit. That is the core problem. They had no dedicated barracks, no single battle standard, no unit name that would cause a historian organizing his material by legion, cohort, or auxiliary regiment to create a chapter heading. They were a status, a legal and social designation that individual soldiers carried while embedded within other formations. An evocatus serving in a legion looked, from any external perspective, exactly like a legionary, differentiated only by a vine staff, a horse, and a slightly different rate of pay that wouldn't show up in the kind of sources ancient historians typically used. An evocatus Augusti in the Praetorian Guard looked like a Praetorian. The distinguishing marks of the Evocati were legible to people inside the system. Other soldiers, commanders, or administrators who knew the military culture well, but largely invisible to outside observers writing history from a civilian or later chronological distance, which is precisely where most of our ancient sources come from. This is why the academic debate about them has been so persistent and sometimes so heated. One school of scholarship holds that the term evocati referred to recalled veterans from any branch of service, any honorably discharged soldier who accepted a personal invitation to re-enlist counted. Another argues that by the imperial period, true evocati, in the formal sense, were exclusively Praetorian veterans re-enlisted under imperial authority, that the evocati Augusti were the real institution, and everything else was informal practice without official standing. The most honest answer, which the best current scholarship has converged on, is that both are partially right, and the apparent contradiction reflects historical evolution rather than definitional confusion. In the Republican period, the evocati were ad hoc. Any commander could recall veterans by personal appeal, and the resulting group of re-enlisted men occupied the recognized status without formal standardization. Under Augustus, the institution was formalized and tiered, a broader category of recalled veterans existing alongside the more prestigious and carefully controlled Evocati Augusti, drawn specifically from the Praetorian pool. The name traveled across a transformation in the underlying institution, which created the appearance of contradiction, where there was actually continuity of practice with increasing formalization. There is a parallel with modern special operations forces that clarifies something important. The most effective special operations units throughout military history have been effective precisely because of their structural invisibility. They operate within the regular force structure while being categorically different from it. Their most important operations are classified or described in language deliberately drained of specificity. The clandestine nature of their most consequential work is a feature. It's what makes the work possible, and it simultaneously makes them nearly impossible to reconstruct from historical sources. Rome had other institutions that operated in this shadow space. The frumentarii, who started as grain supply officers and evolved into military intelligence operatives and assassins. The speculatores, the reconnaissance specialists whose role expanded into covert operations. The exploratores, deep reconnaissance units operating independently behind enemy lines. The Evocati fit naturally into this broader ecosystem of specialized Roman military capability that history has systematically underappreciated. Important, embedded in the system in a way that made them difficult to see from outside it, and therefore consistently underrepresented relative to their actual significance. The epigraphic evidence, the physical inscriptions that survive from the Roman world, carved into stone by soldiers who wanted to be remembered, gives us our most direct access to individual evocati, and it's worth spending a moment with what those inscriptions tell us. Attilius Primus's altar to Jupiter is the most frequently cited example, and rightly so. But there are other inscriptions, other men who identified themselves as evocati with sufficient pride to include the designation on a permanent stone monument. What those inscriptions share, beyond the specific unit identifications and the names of the gods they're dedicated to, is a quality of intentionality. These men made a specific choice to record their status as evocati, not merely as soldiers, not merely as veterans, as men who had been called back. That choice, repeated across multiple individuals across different periods and different locations, tells you something about how the evocati understood their own identity. The recalled status wasn't a secondary detail of their military career. For many of them, it was the definition of it, or the social and civilizational legacy of the evocati and of the broader veteran class they represented at its most experienced and most prestigious tier, is perhaps the most tangible and the most permanently important part of their story, and it's almost entirely missing from the standard historical treatments. Augustus, by 29 BC, had settled approximately 120,000 veterans in 28 new colonies across the Roman world, funded at enormous personal expense from his share of the Egyptian treasury. By the time of his death in 14 AD, the total number of veterans settled through the imperial system reached roughly 300,000 individuals, plus their families, their clients, their dependent freedmen and slaves. These men became the nuclei of new provincial communities. They married into local aristocratic families, each producing children who were simultaneously Roman by legal status and cultural formation, and locally rooted by birth and kinship. They brought Latin as a spoken and written language into communities where it had been foreign. They brought Roman law, Roman commercial practices, Roman religious observances, and Roman architectural habits. Every time you read about the Romanization of Gaul, the fact that by the 2nd century AD, southern France was producing Latin poets and Roman senators, and eventually Roman emperors, had been so thoroughly absorbed into Roman cultural identity that its pre-Roman heritage was nearly invisible in the literary record. That process has soldiers at its foundation. Specifically, it has veterans, men who stayed after the legions moved on, who built houses and opened businesses and sent their sons into the army in their turn, beginning the cycle again. The Evocati, as the highest status tier of that veteran class, the men who had been called back, who had done it twice, who carried the vine staff and the doubled pay and the imperial designation, were disproportionately influential in those settlements. They had connections, they had resources, they had the kind of credibility within the military community that translated directly into social authority in a veteran colony. They were, in their second and third civilian lives, the top of a new provincial social structure that had not existed before Rome created it. That vine staff they carried wasn't just a symbol of the right to discipline soldiers. It was, in the deepest sense, a symbol of what the Roman military system produced at its best. Men who had been through everything the ancient world could throw at a human being, who had survived it all, and who emerged with the judgment and the authority to hold things together wherever they went. The legions built an empire. The Evocati lived in it, shaped it, and passed it on. Nothing lasts forever. The Roman Empire itself is the proof of that, and the institution of the Evocati, like everything else about Rome's remarkable but ultimately mortal military system, eventually ran into the wall of the late empire's cascading and ultimately terminal crises. The 3rd century A.D., the crisis of the 3rd century, roughly 235 to 284 A.D., was a complete systemic collapse. In 50 years, Rome had more than 50 claimants to imperial power. But the average emperor held power for less than 3 years. The economy contracted as coinage was debased. External pressure intensified on every frontier simultaneously. Germanic tribes across the Rhine and Danube, the newly energized Sassanid Persian Empire proving far more militarily capable than the Parthian dynasty it replaced. The Roman army transformed in response to these pressures, and the transformation was deep enough to make the Augustan military system, the system that the Evocati had developed within and depended on, essentially unrecognizable by its end. Mobile cavalry field armies called comitatenses replaced the old static legionary garrison system as the empire's primary offensive force. But barbarian federati, Germanic and other allied warriors serving under their own chiefs on contract to Rome, became an increasingly large and eventually dominant component of Roman military power. The clear institutional distinctions between legion, auxilia, Praetorian Guard, and other military categories blurred and eventually dissolved. The Praetorian Guard itself had been an institution in serious trouble long before Constantine ended it. The Guard had famously sold the imperial throne to the highest bidder in 193 A.D. after murdering the Emperor Pertinax, an act of extraordinary institutional self-destruction that effectively ended their credibility as a force for imperial stability. Septimius Severus, who won the subsequent civil war and consolidated power, dissolved the existing guard and replaced it with troops from his Danubian legions who were personally loyal to him. The character of the institution had changed fundamentally. Its exclusive Italian recruitment, its proximity to legitimate Roman identity, its connection to the Augustan settlement, all of it was gone. When Constantine I defeated his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge on October 28, 312 A.D., and marched into Rome as the new master of the Western Empire, one of his early actions was the complete and final dissolution of the Praetorian Guard. Their barracks, the Castra Praetoria on the northeastern edge of Rome, were demolished. The unit was gone, permanently and without revival. With the Guard dismantled, the Evocati Augusti lost their institutional foundation entirely. The broader tradition of recalled veterans didn't disappear overnight. Soldiers adapt, and the practice of bringing experienced men back for specific needs surely continued informally in the late imperial period. But the formalized, titled, emperor-sanctioned institution that Augustus had built over decades, the system of personal recall and doubled pay and vine staffs and bedchamber guards, that died with the guard. There's something genuinely melancholy in how it ended. Not with a final battle, not with a famous last stand of recalled veterans holding a crumbling line somewhere on the frontier, but with bureaucratic dissolution, with an emperor's edict, with the quiet dismantling of an institution that had been central to Roman military culture for 3.5 centuries. The empire that needed experienced, loyal, personally committed soldiers most desperately, the late empire of the crisis centuries, scrambling to hold its frontiers and its political coherence simultaneously, had lost the institutional means and perhaps the political will to create them. The men who should have gone home, who had chosen to go back, who had renewed their sacred oath and carried their vine staffs and guarded their emperor's bedchambers. Their institution ended not in glory, but in the grinding attrition of imperial decline, which is, perhaps, the most Roman ending imaginable. So let's take a step back and think about what the Evocati actually tell us, not just about Rome, but about the nature of military excellence and the institutions that produce it. Was every serious military in human history has faced the same fundamental problem. How do you create an institution that reliably produces experienced, capable, genuinely committed warriors? And then how do you prevent that experience from walking out the door the moment it becomes legally eligible to leave? Most systems solve this through compulsion, extend the service terms, make honorable discharge harder to obtain, keep men in uniform longer than they might choose. Rome found a different answer. Rome created conditions under which the best soldiers wanted to come back. The doubled pay, the exemptions from labor, the vine staff and the horse, the sacred ceremony with its invocation of divine witness, the title of Sons of Mars. These weren't just material incentives. They were a message, a specific, a carefully constructed message that said, "We see what you've done, we understand what we're asking, and we're asking because you specifically are worth asking, not because you're available, because you're irreplaceable." The generals who understood this most clearly, Caesar, Pompey in his better moments, and above all Augustus, built their power on it. When Octavian walked into those veteran settlements in Campania with nothing but a dead man's name and a teenager's audacity, and the veterans picked up their swords anyway. That was the Evocati system operating at its highest, most consequential level. Not just retaining experienced soldiers for tactical advantage. Transmitting political legitimacy, institutional memory, and personal loyalty across the death of one leader to the rise of another. The veterans were the living bridge between the republic that was gone and the empire that was coming, and they chose to stand on it. The most dangerous soldier in any army isn't the youngest or the most aggressive. It's the one who already knows exactly what he's walking into and walks in anyway. The one who has weighed the cost in full, paid it once, looked at the bill clearly and without illusion, and when the call came, decided to pay it again. That is what Rome understood about its Evocati. That is what the vine staff meant. That is what the Sons of Mars rite was trying to sanctify. And that understanding, the recognition that experience is irreplaceable, that loyalty must be earned and then honored and then earned again, that the best men need to be called by name, outlasted every battle the Evocati ever fought. It outlasted the republic that created them and the empire that formalized them. It is, I would argue, one of the most durable truths that Rome ever discovered about the nature of military excellence. If this deep dive into one of Rome's most overlooked and most fascinating military institutions hit differently than you expected, I genuinely want to know what you think. Drop a comment below. What surprised you most about the Evocati? Was it the sons of Mars right? The bedchamber guards? What role did they play in Octavian's rise? Tell me. And if there's another Roman unit, another forgotten warrior tradition, another corner of the ancient world you want me to drag out of the shadows and into the light, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe if you haven't already. There is a lot more where this came from. Until next time, the history is waiting.